How many times have you wondered if it's really worth trying to be a good person? Perhaps you feel a certain discomfort when you realize that, despite all your efforts to do good, something still seems missing. As if morality were a puzzle where the pieces never quite fit together. This feeling of inadequacy is no accident. Most of us live lost in a maze of contradictory moral rules, trying to please everyone and following principles we often don't even fully understand. What Kant revealed to us about morality seems at first glance so abstract and distant from our everyday reality that we end up creating a barrier between his revolutionary thought and our daily decisions. Perhaps you've felt that deep frustration when trying to understand how ideas as complex as the categorical imperative could possibly apply to your life. As if there were a chasm between the philosophical universe and the real world in which you live. But by the end of this video, I promise you'll have a clear and actionable understanding of why stopping trying to be a good person might be exactly what Kant would recommend, and how it can completely transform your relationship with morality. What we'll discover together will not only expand your understanding of Kantian ethics, but also revolutionize the way you make moral decisions and relate to yourself. Understanding this concept now can make an immediate difference in the quality of your moral existence and the authenticity of your choices. So let's embark on this journey of philosophical discovery, where perhaps the first step toward a truly ethical life is abandoning the obsession with being good. Imagine this situation. You're at work and notice a colleague has made a serious error in a report due tomorrow. No one else has noticed. If you point it out, your colleague will likely be reprimanded, and you might receive praise for your attention to detail. If you remain silent, no one will ever know. What do you do? Many of us would immediately think in terms of consequences. Which option will result in more good and less harm? Or perhaps we would question our intentions. Am I genuinely concerned about the quality of the work, or do I simply want to appear better than my colleague? Kant would say you're asking the wrong questions. What matters, in the Kantian view, is not being perceived as good, nor even feeling like a good person. What matters is acting out of duty, out of respect for the universal moral law that exists within you. Here's the crucial point that many misunderstand about Kant. Morality has nothing to do with trying to be good or achieve good results. It has everything to do with acting according to principles that could be universalized. Kant's Copernican revolution in ethics was precisely to free us from the tyranny of results and external approval. He showed us that moral dignity lies in respect for human rationality, our ability to act according to universal principles. When you act solely to be seen as good, you are treating morality as a means to approval, which contradicts Kant's fundamental principle of treating humanity always as an end, never as a mere means. Morality, for Kant, is not a competition to see who can earn the most goodness points. It is a recognition of one's own rational autonomy. I'm going to pause here and ask you directly. How many times have you caught yourself doing something good just to be recognized by others or to ease your own conscience? This feeling that your goodness is somehow conditioned by external approval or a sense of personal satisfaction. You're not alone in this question. Many of us carry this silent uneasiness, this conflict between what Kant would call natural inclinations and pure moral duty. I'd love for you to share your experience in the comments. It could be something simple like, My biggest difficulty with Kantian morality is separating my desire for approval from my moral duty. Your comment not only helps me create content more targeted to your real needs, but also creates a community where others, who may be facing the same obstacles as you, can feel understood and less alone in their philosophical journey. It's through this honest exchange that we grow together. So please pause the video for a moment and share your experience. Your voice matters more than you know. Returning to our reflection, Kant established a crucial distinction between acting in accordance with duty and acting from duty. When you act in accordance with duty, you are simply following the rules, because doing so coincides with your natural inclinations or brings some benefit. For example, you are honest in a business transaction because you fear the legal consequences of fraud. In this case, your action has no genuine moral value, according to Kant. Now, when you act from duty, you act in compliance with the moral law, regardless of the consequences or inclinations. You are honest in the same business transaction simply because you recognize that honesty is a universal principle that all rational beings should follow, even if it causes you harm. This is true moral action for Kant. Notice how this completely transforms our understanding of what it means to be a good person. It's not about accumulating beneficial actions or cultivating a virtuous character in the eyes of others. It's about respecting the universal moral law that resides within you, about recognizing your own autonomy as a rational being. Kant's famous quote sums up this idea well. Two things fill the soul with ever new and increasing admiration and veneration, the more frequently and persistently I dwell on them: the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. This moral law is not imposed externally, but arises from the very rational nature of human beings. It is an expression of our freedom, not a limitation of it. When Kant proposes the categorical imperative, act only according to that maxim by which you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law, he is inviting us to transcend the particularities of our egoism and think as universal beings. It's important to understand that Kant isn't proposing a cold, calculating morality, as many critics suggest. Rather, he's inviting us to a deeper, more authentic form of morality, one that doesn't depend on external rewards or momentary feelings. When you stop trying to be a good person in the conventional sense and start acting out of respect for duty, something extraordinary happens. You become free. Free from the approval of others, free from unpredictable consequences, free even from the tyranny of your own desires and inclinations. Perhaps this explains why so many people, even those who perform countless good deeds, continue to feel morally unfulfilled. They are trapped in the endless cycle of seeking external validation for their moral choices. The Kantian perspective frees us from this cycle. Consider how transformative it would be to approach your moral decisions not with the question, "What will make me seem or feel like a good person?" but rather, "What principle am I following here, and could it be adopted by everyone without contradiction?" This does not mean ignoring feelings or consequences, but recognizing that the essence of morality lies in something more fundamental: respect for human rationality, both in yourself and in others. Kant himself lived a life that many would consider monotonous and restricted. Born in Königsberg, East Prussia, he rarely left his hometown. He followed such a regular routine that locals adjusted their watches when they saw him pass on his daily walks. Yet, within this seemingly limited existence, Kant created one of the most profound philosophical revolutions in history. He showed us that true freedom lies not in the absence of rules, but in the ability to follow those that our own reason recognizes as universal. This is the paradox that many fail to grasp. It is precisely when we abandon our concern with being good in the eyes of others and submit to the universal moral law that we find our true autonomy. Kant called this autonomy of the will, the idea that we are truly free when we act according to laws that our own reason recognizes as valid for all rational beings. This contrasts with heteronomy, when we act driven by external forces or internal desires, that we do not submit to the scrutiny of universal rationality. How many of our good actions are actually heteronomous? How often do we do good simply to gain recognition, to avoid criticism, or to satisfy an inner desire to feel virtuous? For Kant, these actions have no genuine moral value, no matter how beneficial their results. This fundamental distinction helps us understand why we should stop trying to be good people in the conventional sense. The effort to be seen as good or to accumulate goodness points ultimately corrupts the purity of moral motivation. True moral dignity arises when we act out of respect for duty, recognizing the moral law that exists within us as rational beings. Imagine how liberating it would be to live this way, to do what is right not out of fear of punishment, hope of reward, or desire for approval, but simply because you recognize that it is what any rational being should do. This is the Kantian revolution in morality, a revolution that remains relevant and challenging to this day, perhaps even more so in an age when social media has transformed many of our moral actions into public performances, where the value of the good we do seems to be measured by the number of likes and shares we receive. Kant would invite us to deeply question this dynamic, to ask if there is still room for moral authenticity in a world so preoccupied with appearances. The second formulation of Kant's categorical imperative tells us, act in such a way that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always and simultaneously as an end and never simply as a means. This principle has profound implications for our discussion about stopping trying to be a good person. When you act morally solely to gain approval or to avoid criticism, you are essentially instrumentalizing morality, treating it as a means to an external end. Furthermore, you are treating yourself as a means, as an instrument to produce a certain image or reputation. Kant would argue that this violates the respect you owe yourself as a rational being. True moral dignity lies in recognizing your intrinsic worth as an end in itself, not as a means to impress others or to accumulate social capital. This perspective helps us understand why so many people who constantly strive to be good end up feeling empty or inauthentic. They are unwittingly violating a fundamental principle of Kantian morality, respect for their own humanity as an end in itself. What I'm proposing here is not an abandonment of morality, but a profound transformation in our relationship with it. It's not about stopping doing good, but about stopping doing good for the wrong reasons. It's not about ignoring others, but about truly treating them as ends in themselves, not as audiences for our performances of goodness. The Kantian vision invites us to a more authentic and internalized morality, where moral worth does not depend on external recognition, but on alignment with universal principles that we recognize through our reason. This is a more mature and emancipated form of morality, one that does not depend on rewards or punishments, but on respect for the rationality that defines us as human beings. Imagine how transformative it would be to approach your moral decisions with this clarity, freed from the constant need for external validation. Think about how your relationships with others could become more authentic when you stopped using them as means to feel or appear good, and began treating them genuinely as ends in themselves. Contemporary philosopher Honora O'Neill, one of Kant's leading interpreters, suggests that the categorical imperative is essentially a test to see if we are respecting the rational autonomy of others. When you act on a maxim that cannot be universalized, you are essentially creating an exception for yourself, treating yourself as special and superior to others. For example, when you lie to gain an advantage, you are implicitly asserting that your own convenience is more important than respecting the rationality of others. You are denying them the truthful information they would need to exercise their own rational autonomy. This is why, for Kant, lying is always morally wrong, even in cases where it appears to produce good results. Lying treats others as means, not as ends in themselves worthy of respect. This is a controversial position, and many philosophers disagree with it, pointing to cases where lying seems morally necessary, such as lying to a murderer to protect an innocent victim. But what is important to understand here is the fundamental principle behind the Kantian position: unconditional respect for the rational autonomy of human beings. This principle transcends the superficial concern with being seen as good or with accumulating beneficial actions. In the Critique of Practical Reason, Kant develops the concept of the highest good, the perfect union between virtue and happiness. He acknowledges that, ideally, those who act morally should be happy, and that there is something deeply disturbing in the idea that virtue and happiness could be permanently separated. However, Kant insists that we should not act morally to be happy. Rather, we should act morally because it is our duty, and only then can we reasonably expect to be worthy of happiness. This is another way of understanding why we should stop trying to be good people. True virtue does not arise from the direct pursuit of rewards, be they happiness, social recognition, or personal satisfaction. Genuine virtue arises when we act out of duty, out of respect for the universal moral law. It is only then that we become truly worthy of happiness, even if it is not guaranteed to us in the imperfect world in which we live. Kant posits the existence of God and the immortality of the soul as postulates of practical reason, precisely to resolve this dilemma, so that we may have reasonable hope that, ultimately, virtue and happiness will be reconciled, even if this does not happen within the limits of our earthly experience. This perspective offers profound comfort when we confront the apparent injustices of the world, where we often see virtuous people suffering and vicious people thriving. For Kant, morality is not a strategy to ensure good outcomes in this life, but a recognition of our nature as rational beings capable of acting according to universal principles. It is in this, not in the accumulation of rewards or social approval, that our true moral dignity resides. When you stop trying to be a good person in the conventional sense and start acting out of respect for duty, you are aligning yourself with this deeper, more authentic conception of morality. It is no longer about appearing good in the eyes of others, or even in your own eyes, but about respecting the moral law that exists within you as a rational being. This transformation in your relationship with morality can be profoundly liberating, allowing you to break free from the endless cycle of seeking external validation for your moral choices. And paradoxically, it is when you stop worrying about being good that you become truly capable of genuine kindness, the kind that arises not from a desire for reward or recognition, but from respect for the rationality that defines us as human beings. One of the most common criticisms of Kantian ethics is that it appears cold and disconnected from human feelings. Critics argue that a morality based purely on reason, with no room for compassion, empathy, and other moral sentiments, would be an impoverished and even inhumane morality. This is a misreading of Kant. He is not suggesting that we should completely ignore our feelings, but rather that we should not allow them to determine our moral decisions. Feelings are fickle, variable from person to person, and easily influenced by external circumstances. Basing morality on them would be building it on quicksand. Reason, on the other hand, offers a universal and stable foundation for morality. This does not mean that feelings have no place in the moral life. Indeed, Kant recognizes that feelings such as respect for the moral law and reverence for duty are important components of moral experience. What he rejects is the idea that these feelings should be the basis or criterion for deciding what is right or wrong. This distinction is crucial to understanding why we should stop trying to be good people in the conventional sense, often associated with feeling good or being recognized as good. Kantian morality invites us to a more mature and emancipated form of goodness, one that does not depend on immediate emotional rewards or external validation, but on alignment with universal principles we recognize through our reason. This does not mean ignoring the suffering of others or acting without compassion. On the contrary, it means treating others with a deeper and more consistent respect, recognizing their rational autonomy even when it does not produce immediate emotional satisfaction for us. Consider, how many of our supposedly altruistic actions are actually tainted by selfish motivations? We do good to feel good about ourselves, to be admired by others, or to avoid feelings of guilt. Kant invites us to transcend these impure motivations and act out of a more fundamental and consistent respect for humanity, both in ourselves and in others. In Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant presents the famous example of the honest merchant. This merchant does not cheat his customers, not because he values honesty per se, but because he knows that honesty is good for business in the long run. In the eyes of the world, he is an honest merchant and is perhaps even admired for his integrity. However, for Kant, his actions lack genuine moral value because they are not motivated by respect for duty, but by considerations of self-interest. This distinction between appearing good and acting out of duty is fundamental to Kantian ethics and helps us understand why we should stop worrying about being seen as good. Genuine moral value lies not in appearances or results, but in purity of intention, in acting out of respect for the universal moral law. When you stop trying to be a good person in the conventional sense and start acting out of duty, you are aligning yourself with this deeper and more authentic conception of morality. True virtue is not a performance for others or for yourself, but a silent and consistent recognition of the moral law that exists within you as a rational being. Perhaps the most radical and liberating aspect of Kantian ethics is its insistence on moral autonomy. For Kant, genuine morality does not come from following externally imposed rules, be they religious, social, or legal. It comes from recognizing the moral law that exists within us as rational beings, and from freely deciding to act in accordance with that law out of respect for it. This insight revolutionized ethics, shifting its source from external authority to internal rationality. When you act morally, not because you fear punishment or desire reward, but because you recognize the universality of the principle you are following, you are exercising your moral autonomy in the Kantian sense. This does not mean doing what you want, but recognizing what any rational being should do and freely choosing to act accordingly. This is true moral freedom, which consists not in the absence of constraints, but in voluntary submission to laws that our own reason recognizes as valid for all rational beings. When you stop trying to be a good person to please others or to satisfy your ego and start acting out of respect for duty, you are exercising your moral autonomy in an authentic way. The Kantian perspective on morality has profound implications for our daily lives. It invites us to critically examine our motivations, to ask whether we are acting out of duty or merely according to duty. It challenges us to transcend superficial morality based on appearances and results, and to seek a deeper, more authentic form of goodness based on respect for human rationality. This does not mean that we should become cold or insensitive, but that we should subordinate our natural feelings and inclinations to the judgment of practical reason. When faced with moral dilemmas, the Kantian approach invites us to ask, can I will the maxim of my action to become a universal law? Am I treating the people involved as ends in themselves, never merely as means? Am I respecting the rational autonomy of all those affected by my decision? These questions take us beyond the superficial concern with being seen as good or accumulating goodness points, and direct us to the core of genuine morality, respect for the rationality that defines us as human beings. In an increasingly polarized and tribal world, where we often judge people's goodness based on their conformity to certain social norms or political positions, the Kantian perspective offers a powerful corrective. It reminds us that true morality lies not in belonging to the right group or championing the right causes, but in acting based on principles that respect the rational autonomy of all human beings. It invites us to look beyond appearances and question whether our actions, however well-intentioned they may seem, truly respect others as ends in themselves. When we stop trying to be good people in the conventional sense and start acting out of respect for duty, we open space for a more authentic and consistent form of morality, one that does not depend on external validation or momentary feelings, but on alignment with universal principles that we recognize through our reason. This is a more mature and emancipated form of goodness, one that frees us from the endless cycle of seeking approval for our moral choices and allows us to act with true autonomy and dignity. Kant's central message for us today could be summarized as follows: stop trying to be a good person and start respecting the moral law within yourself. Stop worrying about how your actions are perceived by others, and start asking whether they could be universalized without contradiction. Stop using morality as a means to obtain approval or personal satisfaction, and start treating it as an end in itself, as an expression of your dignity as a rational being. This shift in perspective can be profoundly liberating, allowing you to free yourself from the tyranny of others' opinions and the fickleness of your own feelings, and find a more solid and consistent foundation for your moral decisions. And paradoxically, it is when you stop worrying about being good that you become truly capable of genuine goodness, the kind that arises not from the desire for reward or recognition, but from respect for the rationality that defines us as human beings. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by the complexities of moral thought, know that you're not alone on this journey. The path to understanding Kant doesn't have to be lonely or confusing. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and join this community of people who, like you, seek clarity. Amidst the maelstrom of fragmented information about philosophy, by subscribing, you'll receive weekly reflections that transform seemingly inaccessible concepts into practical insights for your life. We're not just studying philosophy. We're learning to think more deeply, question more wisely, and live more purposefully. Click the subscribe button now, not as an obligation, but as a gift for your own intellectual development. And if this content brought you any clarity today, please leave a like as a way to say that we're together in this quest for true knowledge. Remember, understanding Kant isn't just an academic exercise. It's a way of awakening to a more conscious and authentic existence, where we stop trying to be good people to impress others and begin to respect the moral law within ourselves as an expression of our dignity as rational beings.